Are there sort of basic sort of collections of medical herbs in small doses that you would say, okay, this is like a nice sort of foundational level to just maintain? I mean, like, I'm a relatively healthy person, eat very well, obviously, don't have too much stress in my life. Is there sort of like the equivalent of a multivitamin foundational support in terms of like collections of medical herbs that you think most people would benefit from?
Yeah, I struggle to kind of give generic advice, I guess, for that, because I think
Yeah.
it is different for everyone. I guess some of the more nutritive ones, so like nettles maybe. The other, what's might be interesting for you to look at as well is in Ayurvedic medicine, you have these kind of tonics which are used for longevity. And I quite like the idea of these. So there's things like Gotu Kola, which I guess if I was kind of thinking about
Yeah.
anything, I'd probably just go with something like that. Maybe just Gotu Kola, because it's going to be good for kind of brain function, and it has that tradition used for kind of longevity. So I think that's kind of what I'd be going for, the Ayurvedic, these longevity tonics, because I just feel like that's kind of what we all want, really, isn't it? So, they're the ones to go for.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
Well, first off, I should say thanks so much for giving me some of your teas. I really enjoyed drinking those over the last couple of months because we met at the Integrative and Personalized Medicine Conference earlier this year.
Yes. Oh, I'm pleased you like them. Yeah. Which is your favourite then? I think you had the happy gut, didn't
gave
you?
me. Yeah, I had the happy gut, and I think you also gave me a valerian-based one. Am I getting that
Yes.
right?
Yeah, the chill out one. Actually, it's Tulsi.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
Tulsi's the main
Tulsi.
house.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and lemon balm, I think, in that one. So, yeah.
Gorgeous. Yeah. No, it was wonderful. And I made them into sort of like, because obviously it was during the summer, I kind of brewed it and let them cool. And then
Yeah.
I added a tiny bit of sweetener and I'd put them into glass bottles and I'd have them during the day over ice and stuff. So it was actually really, they were great. I loved them.
Yeah. My favourite's the happy gut. Like, I kind of go between the different ones, but that's my favourite at the moment. So, yeah, and I like the fact that you can get a few bags from them. So I'm usually getting like 3 cups from each of the little pyramids. So that I was really happy about that when we kind of formulated them. Yeah, because you don't know, obviously you make the formulas, they obviously, we had to source the herbs, and then they were made up by there's a company that makes them into the little pyramids, and you don't quite know how it's going to turn out. You can sample them beforehand, and they're blends that I've used for a long time, but it's different when it's in the pyramid. You kind of get a different flavor, and the herbs are the size of how much they've been chopped down, and that all affects the flavor and everything. So I wasn't quite sure how they were going to turn out, but yeah, I was really happy. We've been, I was really happy how they turned out. So it's been exciting, whole journey, really.
Yeah, well, you should be because they're delicious. And I wanted to start really just talking to you about how you got into medical herbalism, because you trained as a doctor. You spent a few years doing hospital medicine, but from what I gather from your CV, you very quickly sort of pivoted into medical herbalism, and I wonder why. Maybe you could take us back as to what happened perhaps early in your life.
Yeah, so I do think about it because lots of people ask me. So I have thought about it over the years, what kind of influenced me. And I think probably the seeds were set from an early age, although I didn't realize, because I grew up on a farm and we grew a lot of, like, the food was from the farm. So we've always kind of, the family, we grew our own vegetables. We were really into like organic vegetables and growing everything in the garden. So I was really always interested in nutrition. And then I had an allotment when I was a medical student. So, I kind of, that food was the first way in, really, was the nutrition. But before I went to medical school, I spent a year living as a nanny, and I just by chance I answered an ad in the Lady magazine. Actually, I was just looking for my gap year to do something interesting, so I answered an ad, and I ended up in Drôme Provence, which is sort of in the mountains, the south of France, and just that area is it's very lots of biodynamic organic farms. There's a really big kind of a cultural just use of herbs in the south of France as like tisanes, and it's kind of embedded in the culture there. So I didn't really know anything about it. I just went. I was living with the family as a nanny, and it was just going to the market every week. So you'll see like the big bags of the linden flowers, and everybody's drinking like lime flower tea in the evening, and it's just so much part of the culture there. And then obviously I started going to, the pharmacies in France, where you'll kind of get half of the pharmacy is like the homeopathic medicines or the herbal medicines, and the pharmacists are trained to be able to advise on it. And I just it was total eye opener. I hadn't really seen that. I hadn't really had any contact with it before, but it just kind of opened my eyes a bit, thinking, okay, this is interesting. It's a different way of doing things. And then actually the family that I ended up living with used anthroposophical medicine, which is a kind of a combination of herbs and homeopathy. It's based on Rudolf Steiner's work, and that's just what the family happened to use. And obviously me living there and having sort of minor ailments meant that they treated, like the father treated me with different things out of their sort of family cabinet, and I just was like, oh my god, these actually work. I didn't really, I had really no idea of what they were. And the first thing that ever I used was, I remember to this day still, that there was like a fold up sofa, and I was pulling it out, and I got my fingers trapped in the sofa, and it was this huge indentation in my finger where the bed had actually collapsed on my hand. And he just gave me some arnica cream to put on it. So I put this arnica cream and I went to bed. And then the next morning, it's just completely gone. There was nothing. And I thought, there's no bruising. There's absolutely nothing. But my hand had been completely crushed in this bed. And that was the first thing I thought, my God, this is like magic cream. What is this stuff? So I got interested from there. And then, the harvest, we lived in the valley where the lavender flowers were harvested. And then in the village was where they distilled the essential oils for the lavender. So, that was also part of the local culture, was the growing the lavender oil. So it was really just being embedded in that culture for a year, I think. And then after I left, as I was going through medical school, different summers, I traveled a lot in India. I went to India 4 times. And so I kind of got interested in Ayurvedic medicine then. After that, really was going to India, and homeopathy, which is kind of quite popular in India as well. So I got a little bit of introduction to that. And I saw, just as I was getting more interested, and I was up in the mountains, I went to see like a Tibetan doctor, just to see what it was all about. It was the doctor actually that the Dalai Lama used up in Dharamsala. Wow. So I just thought, I'm going to go see him for consultation, and it was just a really interesting experience. So I did that. I started getting interested in yoga. I did some yoga up there as well, and then when I did my elective for my in my 4th year, medical school, I ended up in Australia, and I went to sort of in the outback in Tennant Creek, and I actually was at the hospital originally, but then quickly moved and ended up in the Aboriginal Health Centre, which was really interesting because they had a lot of different projects going on there. But you could go out into the reservations and talk to some of the elder Aboriginal community leaders. So I learned a little bit about the bush medicine and the sort of Aboriginal culture. And also they had a big sort of drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre where they were using art therapy. So I kind of spent a little bit of time in that. So I just kind of got interested in all sorts of different approaches. And then I had some health problems. I think they were probably stress induced, and also induced after going to India and getting amoebic dysentery and, a bit of food poisoning. Yeah. So I ended up actually sort of using some herbal medicine and acupuncture on myself. And I think it just all kind of came together. And then as I went through hospital medicine and working in the hospital for a few years, I just started to feel like I want more time. The time was the big thing for me. I just want a bit more time with people, and I want to feel like I'm not just using a sticking plaster, that I can help to get to the root of problems. And I was obviously with the food thing, and I know this amazing campaign you're doing with the food hospital, but like 20 years ago, I was trying to say, I remember one, elderly lady who was recovering. She'd had a gynae operation, ended up in our urology department, very ill, and she was just not eating anything. And I could just see she's literally wasting away. Like, she's having no protein. How can she be expected to heal from 2 major surgeries? She's not eating any protein. It was just simple things. And I just kept sort of saying things. And I felt a bit like, nobody's listening. It's very difficult to create change. There were things that I wanted to try and introduce. I was talking about gut microbiome, and maybe for Clostridium difficile. This was like 20 years ago, and people were just like, what are you talking about? You're just completely loony. So I just kind of after a few years, I just felt like I'm really not in the right place here. It's going to be so difficult to change anything, and I don't feel like I'm really making the change that I want to do, and I haven't got time with people to try and address the root cause of things and to do a more preventative approach, which is kind of what I was really getting interested in. And so I just thought, it was by chance, I just found someone gave me a leaflet, I think, for the herbal medicine degree, and I thought, this is quite interesting. I was kind of skeptical, to be fair, at the beginning, but I just thought, with an interest in plants and looking for a more holistic approach, I thought, okay, this could be, and obviously the experience I'd had in France, I thought, okay, this could be interesting, maybe for minor ailments, there's maybe something in this. And I was also kind of thinking about, okay, we're going to have this, obviously this big problem with antibiotic resistant, maybe I was starting to look at herbs as alternatives for like minor infections, and thinking, okay, maybe this could be an area for research. You could be looking at, okay, can we use some of these antiseptic properties in the plants to help reduce antibiotic resistance and things like that. Then maybe I'm interested to look at the research and to kind of look into it more. So I started the degree not really knowing where it would go, but hoping that I would actually eventually be able to bring it into like an NHS practice and actually amalgamate it somehow. And then I got completely inspired when I did my summer placement. So you have to do, like, each year you do so many clinical hours. You have to do 500 clinical hours over the 4-year degree. So a lot of mine was spent in summer placements. There used to be, actually, it's gone now, but it was a clinic of herbal medicine in the Archway Hospital in North London, and it was actually on the hospital premises. And there was a really close connection with one of the medical herbalists working there and the gynae department. And she worked very closely with quite a few of the consultant gynecologists. And we would get a lot of patients who were waiting for hysterectomies, or patients that didn't want to have a hysterectomy. So we'd get quite a lot of endometriosis patients, also polycystic ovaries, and quite a lot of menopause patients as well that didn't want to take HRT. So that was kind of one of the specialties of the clinic. And I spent quite a lot of summer placements there, and actually that's what totally swayed me. Like, this is amazing. Like, actually the results we're getting, there's so many women that are not having to go for a hysterectomy. Actually, we're just completely turning things around. And that's when I kind of thought, okay, this is not just about helping a sore throat. There's actually a lot more in this, and you can do a lot if you really have the time with people and you tailor it. And it's a complicated, it's obviously much more complicated than just giving someone some sage for a sore throat, but the potential of what you could do with it. So I think that's kind of what turned the corner for me. And then when I finished the degree, I had 2 small children by this point as well, because I'd had 2 babies. I had one in my first year of the herbal medicine degree and one in my 3rd year. So I was kind of thinking, how am I going to make all of this work? And I thought, I'll just set up a practice and see how it goes. So I set up just a small private clinic, and it was just immediately like completely full. So I sort of did it just filled within 3 weeks. I had, like, the phone was just ringing all the time. And I couldn't actually manage the capacity was a bit overwhelming. Actually, wasn't really expecting it, but over the years, I just, I've seen thousands of patients now, but it's evolved, and I started very general, so I was doing a lot, just kind of seeing all sorts of. I had lots of kind of elderly patients with arthritis, or children with eczema, or sort of recurrent chest infections, ear infections, that sort of. Then quite a lot of digestive, IBS type problems. So it was very general to start with, and then slowly over the years, I got more and more women's health type issues. It slowly became a lot of menopause patients. That just kind of happened. I didn't really go out looking for it, but it just sort of gravitated towards more women's health. And then I kind of thought, okay, if these are the patients that I'm going to be seeing, I need to kind of specialize my training. And there were gaps. I felt like there was gaps in my knowledge, and so slowly I keep doing more and more. As time goes on, I did the medical acupuncture training. I think initially that was nice. I was using quite a lot of medical acupuncture for a while, again, especially with the arthritis patients. So I'd often be doing some nutrition, some herbal medicine, and then acupuncture. So I did that for quite a few years. And then actually so I was doing my appraisals through the Independent Doctors Federation, which are sort of for doctors working outside the NHS, really. And my appraiser was this amazing guy who he'd done all sorts of things, but he was a GP in Sussex, and he'd done the homeopathy training. So his background was actually he was an army doctor, and then he'd done homeopathy, which was a really interesting mix. I wouldn't have ever put the two together, but he kept telling me, like, you need to do homeopathy, you're really missing out, you're missing this massive tool. And the whole 3 years I had him as my appraiser, he's like, you need to go do the homeopathy training. He's like, herbs are good, but homeopathy's the king. You need to go and do that training. So eventually I did. He recommended me to go to Bristol. So that's, I went to what's the National Centre of Integrative Medicine now, and I did the 5 years homeopathy with them, which was good. It's like another tool that I do use in my practice. And then I did bioidentical hormone therapy training, really for the menopause patients that I felt like needed that extra support. And then I started the functional medicine training, which has been like I knew that there were gaps in the nutrition, really, that I needed to kind of get more knowledge, particularly with all the gut microbiome stuff that I was really interested in. And, that it's a good kind of way of getting more into the biochemistry and the, the kind of gut microbiome stuff in more detail. So I'm doing the certification with the IFM, nearly finished, but so that sort of pulls it together as well. But so and then it's kind of developed, really.
That's one way of putting it. It's definitely developed over the last 18 plus years, your experience and stuff. I just want to go back a bit because clearly, you've got a lot of experience on these different areas. But going back to France, where I guess all of this sort of started, I wasn't aware that there was as much of a culture around sort of herbalism and nutritional medicine as almost on par with the sort of culture within traditional Indian medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. It was actually a follower of mine, I think she was an email subscriber, she reached out and said, in south of France we have all these sort of herbs and stuff, and we have this sort of practice, and I was kind of blown away at like how involved it is, and also how pharmacists sort of sit alongside that conventional medicine very, very nicely, as they do in Germany. Yes. I think I read something about Germany having a similar sort of approach to traditional medicine. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And Germany was another inspiration for me, that model, because, and actually at medical school, I had a friend who was German. She did like an intercalated year with us, and it was really
Mm.
interesting learning about their training, because in Germany, actually part of the training, you do herbal medicine module and you do a homeopathy module, and that's just part of the undergraduate training.
Oh
And
wow.
I was just like, oh my goodness. And I think with pharmacists as well. And in fact, actually with I know it's the same in Poland, because one of the staff we have now working in the centre she's a nutritionist, but she's a pharmacist as well, and she's Polish. And she said that she's got a really extensive herbal medicine knowledge from her pharmacy training in
Mm.
Poland. So again, it's just Poland is also another massive cultural tradition there. And I'll often have Polish. I've had a lot of Polish patients over the years, because that's just the tradition that they use it again, just part of the everyday medicine that they're very used to using. But I mean, absolutely in
Mm.
France, I mean, I know that you just go into the pharmacy, you can get calendula tincture really easily, if you've got a wound, or you need to, it's just, or calendula cream if you've got some skin rash, it's just there, and the pharmacist will just give it, that they'll just say, oh yes, here, it's just part of that, completely part. And I would say, half, almost half and half. You've got half your sort of conventional drug medications, half is herbs and homeopathy, and it's just assumed that, for certain things we'll go to that side, and for certain things we'll go for that side, and they're very comfortable and knowledgeable with the whole spectrum, really. And
We're gonna have to talk about some of those names, because that kind of just rolled off the tongue for you, but for me, it went way over my head. And also, I just wanted to touch on your experience in Australia, because I mean, I used to practice in Australia. I was out there for a couple of years, and I remember going to some of the markets and meeting someone who's from an Aboriginal background, and she was telling me about all these different bush herbs from a culinary perspective, and I was trying them, and I bought a whole bunch of different herbs to experiment, and they were like nothing I've ever tried before. It was like this really sort of wonderful collection of different astringent based herbs, bitter herbs, like flavors that I've never sort of experienced before. And whenever I think of Australian food, and whenever people I think of Australian food, they think of avocado and toast, that sort of brunch sort of food.
yeah,
But there's just such rich herbs and such rich plants, and a diversity of different ingredients that are inherent in the Australian mainland, that we just don't really make that much use of. So I just wonder if there's going to be sort of a resurgence of all these like traditional herbs used in the culinary sense that also have medicinal purposes as well.
yeah. I mean, you can see it with a lot of the ayurvedic herbs, can't you? I mean, they've become so popular,
Mm,
turmeric and all the, that's obviously the biggest one, isn't
exactly.
it?
Yeah.
But you can kind of see that will happen. Like, you kind of see over the years, okay, that's the new one that everybody's kind of talking about. But as time goes by, I'm sure that will happen, because there's so many. And
Yeah.
also you see with like fermented food, don't you, as well, the fact that that's so much part of some traditional systems and cultures, and that now we're sort of like, oh, fermented food, great, it does all these amazing beneficial things, like maybe we should be eating it, but it, it's maybe not part of our tradition here until quite recently, is it? So
Yeah, absolutely. We've been chatting for about 20 minutes, and we haven't really discussed exactly what we mean by herbal medicine and what it actually involves. So perhaps we should start there, and then we could sort of wander down a bit of the history around medical herbalism, actually what it means to be a medical herbalist, and then dive into some of the herbs that I have no real experience of prescribing or using, and that's why I'm fascinated to do a bit of a deep dive into some
yeah,
of them with you today.
so I mean, the term is not protected, so in terms of there's no protection or regulation surrounding the use of the word, of the term, the title. So I would say, I mean, that's a key thing, is knowing, if people are looking for a herbalist, to look for somebody who's gone through the sort of is registered with a regulatory body, with the, I mean, that we can talk about that later, but there are some bodies where people have to have a certain knowledge, and
Mm,
really have a degree in herbal medicine. So in terms of the title, it isn't protected. So, and obviously there's loads of different traditions of herbal medicine, but it's basically, the key thing is you're using the whole plant extracts. So, and that can be different parts of the plant. So it's very often aerial parts, but it could be the roots, the bark, the seeds, the fruit, rhizomes, all parts of the plant. But the main thing is that you're using the plant in its kind of whole sense, rather than extracting an isolated constituent, because obviously lots of drugs come from plants, so but what you're doing with a drug is you're taking one isolated constituent, often an alkaloid, which is some of the strongest ones, and you're then synthetically manufacturing it. So that's kind of the difference, and it's very targeted. So normally if you're taking one constituent out of the plant, it will have a targeted effect on particular receptors, and so it's very targeted in the body. Whereas when you're looking at using the whole plant as a medicine, you're obviously getting hundreds of constituents in there, and so it has a lot of kind of multiple effects in the body. And often the theory is, and I think it is true from my practice, is that it's generally very well tolerated, herbal medicine, and there are a few side effects. There's sometimes sometimes particularly digestive symptoms. So some people might just get a bit of diarrhea or unsettled stomach, that so it's not completely without any side effects, but generally mild and generally very well tolerated. And that's thought to be because within the whole plant you often get kind of buffering constituents, things which can counteract these stronger, particularly the alkaloids. For example, a really good example I often give is like with ephedra, which is a Chinese herb. So you have in that, you can extract like epinephrine. So that's obviously got quite a stimulating, kind of increased blood pressure. But then actually within the plant, you have other constituents which actually lower blood pressure. So when you take the whole plant together, you get a more balanced effect in the body. And that's often what you'll see. You start extracting constituents, and some things will do one thing, and then you'll find another constituent which almost does the opposite, or actually, sometimes it works synergistically as well. Sometimes you'll get like saponins in a plant which can help some of the other active constituents to be absorbed across the phospholipid membrane into the cell. So sometimes the constituents act synergistically, and sometimes they act to buffer the more active, stronger parts. So they're kind of like a safety. So that's the main difference between the two.
Gotcha. And sorry to interrupt. And just to be clear, so when we're talking about medical herbalism, we're really talking about the utility of these plants in sort of in a prescriptive manner, rather than culinary.
Yeah.
Or is there sort of like a spectrum where there's quite a bit of overlap in the middle of it? And the other thing I just wanted to clarify is when you said rhizome, is that to mean like the root, like like ginger or turmeric, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I think it's a spectrum, because like obviously some herbs sit in the middle, don't they? They can be culinary, they can be medicinal. It's sometimes to do with dosing, but I mean, I think it's a very kind of, it is definitely a spectrum. If you think of garlic, I mean, garlic and ginger are good examples. We use them in cooking all the time, but they can have medicinal effects. And the same with lots of the spices, lots of the spices, and turmeric's obviously another good example, which is something used in cooking, but it has a medicinal effect. It's usually to do with the dosing. So, the higher the dose and the more consistently that you take it. So often with herbs, they need to be taken consistently to kind of to build up to having a medicinal effect in the body. So say for like, I don't know, chamomile tea, you could have chamomile tea, 1 cup of tea. Okay, it's going to have a very minor effect. If you have maybe 3 or 4 cups of chamomile tea, which are a strong infusion, and you do that every day regularly, that's going to have a more medicinal effect. So that it's to do with dosing and the regularity that you use it. And then the spectrum is, you'll find that some herbs sit in that sort of food end, and then they obviously get stronger and stronger in terms of their active constituents till you go up to kind of poisonous plants, really. So, and some plants are obviously toxic and poisonous and have very strong constituents in. And then you can also have some herbs which are just very nutritious. So they're almost medicinal by being very nutritious, like maybe nettles, which I think, nettles are, they're used in medical herbalism for their nutrition. So they would be used if you think someone's, say, very depleted or anemic, or, you're going to use them to help to improve the nutritional status, and you could use it as a source of iron. So you might actually think, okay, well, nettles, they're sort of a food, but they're nutritious. Like they would actually fit into medical herb as well. But it's a hugely grey area, because obviously some herbs are food, and how often do you take them? And it's a grey area for that one, for sure. I mean, the herbs sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I like the example you used of Vafidra, actually, because I think that's quite telling about medical herbalism in a lot of ways. In sort of conventional pharmaceutical conventional pharmaceuticals, or at least for the way I think about pharmacology, you have a constituent that's come from a plant, among which many other drugs have actually been derived from, in a high enough dose to have a fantastic effect. I mean, we use this in anaphylaxis and in ICU and all these different areas, whereas in the whole plant that it's been derived from, you have all these different constituents of it that actually mellow that effect. So it makes it less effective in that particular setting, but it might be more widely tolerated in a milder form in different sort of disease or condition states. Is that a fair assessment, would you say? Or?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say generally herbs take longer to take effect for that reason. Like, not always. You can use herbs in acute settings, and if you use kind of megadoses in, you can use them in first aid, for example. But generally, as a whole, they're better suited for chronic conditions where you expect that they're going to take a little bit longer to have an effect. So so for that reason, I think that that's how you would kind of expect to see, like, if I was using herbs, I'd probably I'd expect to see a change within 3 or 4 weeks. So if using consistently, so you're kind of aware when you're using them, they're going to take a bit longer as well. But that's the thing that they'll often, the good thing, which I enjoy using them, is that you'll often see that they take longer, but they're often providing this kind of, I always see them as being quite nutritious. A lot of herbs are nutritious as well and supportive to the body. So, for example, adaptogens, which are herbs that can help support the body when it's under stress. So they often help to bring about homeostasis in the body, and they help to counteract the effects of cortisol and stress hormones. And so actually you use them to just slowly improve resilience in the body. So they're quite nutritive. So often I see plants as being quite nutritive. When you're using them, you're using to support different organs or systems in the body in quite a nutritive way.
I want to talk about adaptogens in a second, actually, but I just wanted to remark on a couple of things that I've noticed over just looking at a variety of different sort of traditional cultures that have used herbs, spices, and different herbs in a medical sense. There seems to be quite a lot of overlap. Is that something that you've come across as well within the traditional Chinese medicine, even sort of Native American medicine and Ayurveda? Is there an overlap?
Yeah, massively. Yeah, and the history is really interesting, actually. So if you look at the history, you'll see like there's definitely different traditions. And you asked me about the history, and we kind of skipped over that, didn't we? But if you think of actually a lot of the earliest records of using herbs go back maybe 3,000 years. And you'll see even sometimes those plants actually that were mentioned way thousands of years ago. They're still being used now. There's such a long traditional use of them. But you can look at different medical systems as well, and there's very often a root of the way that the imbalances in the body are described. So you'll often see patterns. It's a very much kind of a medicine based on looking at patterns within the body. So particularly like with Ayurveda, obviously you have these doshas, don't you, with the Pitta, Kapha, Vata, and then which kind of represent heat and fluid and air or wind in the body. And then in Chinese medicine, you'll have a similar, there's a similar principle, where you have, so there's often these almost kind of root imbalances that you see within many of the traditional systems. And in our kind of traditional Western herbal medicine, which was the humoral system, you see it there as well, like the different humors of the body. There's very often this looking at a balance of damp and dryness, or heat and cold. And then you're very often looking at kind of stagnation in the body or constriction of tissues. There's often looking at tissue states, or you're looking at the particularly heat and cold is a huge thing. When you're looking at traditional medical systems, you're looking at is that particularly in Chinese medicine, you'd say, there's stagnation and heat. Sort of damp heat is often considered to be, if you imagine arthritis where there's a lot of swelling and heat in a joint, you would say that's damp heat with stagnation. So you're kind of describing what you're seeing. I see it as just very descriptive. People didn't understand the body, but they could kind of describe what they were seeing, and they would describe these imbalances and obviously start to put patterns together. So you see that very much, and then you see herbs being used to counteract those imbalances. So you might see, okay, if you've got a damp heat condition, you're going to use a cooling dry herb to counteract that. It's very much the way that we would say, oh, it's an anti-inflammatory. Okay, the traditional system will say it's cooling and drying, or it's moving stagnation. That's kind of how they're describing it. So you'll see those herbs.
It's interesting because it's almost like it overlaps on to sort of the psychological symptoms and signs as well of the individual. So like I can only speak to Ayurveda, but if someone is described as too hot, it could also be pointing to things like stresses in their life, or how they're not sort of moving on from certain things in their past, or there's like some sort of emotional trauma in there that needs to be worked through, as well as the physical side. And I think sometimes the limitations of how people outside of medical herbalism see it was like, oh well, they're just sort of treating it with a pill. But especially in your practice, you think of the individual more holistically, where you look at their emotional support, their psychotherapy, and all the other sort of context of what makes a healthy mind and body.
Yeah, and definitely, and like in a lot of the traditional systems, you'll see this connection, say, between heat and the liver and anger. For example, in China, in Chinese medicine, they'll say, okay, if you're angry or you're having mood swings, that's a liver stagnation, or that's maybe liver heat, or so you'll see the language of it. It's very holistic in the way you describe, and absolutely, you'll kind of say, oh, melancholy and depression, maybe that's a kind of cold, stagnant condition. You want to kind of use warming, stimulating herbs. That's very much in the traditional systems. You'll see this, the way that the emotional symptoms are very closely related to the physical ones. They're kind of part of the whole spectrum of the imbalance that you're looking for. So, and the herbs are used, in that way. So, and there's two kind of, there's often, most medical herbalists are using some of that traditional system plus the more science that we understand about the active constituents, and maybe what's kind of called phytotherapy, which is a little bit more, say, when you're using something as an anti-inflammatory or antispasmodic, or maybe a bit using them in that sort of way. But I think having the knowledge and pulling it together, it's particularly helpful where patients have multiple symptoms, where you're kind of can take a step. That's what I've enjoyed using, and that's what I love about using an integrated system is, you it's very easy to just step back and go, okay, that's connected to that and that's connected to that, and I pull it all together and I can see that there's these maybe 3 different root problems, and we're going to slowly target each one, and then you just see the symptoms, this whole picture just starting to change, and a lot of those, what were seemingly individual, unconnected problems, just actually they're often the root's the same.
Yeah. No, I find it fascinating. And so you mentioned this term adaptogenic, that or adaptogens, that I hear being banded around everywhere now. Like it's in everything from hot chocolates to my coffee to my sweets. I'm not that I eat that many sweets, but like brownies and all that kind of stuff. And I don't like know too much about this area, I'll be honest. So I know ashwagandha. I know that there's some different types of dried mushrooms that have adaptogenic properties. Why don't we define exactly what an adaptogen is? Like, where this term even came from, and what are what are adaptogens?
They're definitely the new trend, aren't they? I think everyone like, oh wow, everyone's talking about them. I think they're really cool. I mean, I like them because there's not that they are a particular there's a particular property within herbs that has this action that you don't really get in from anything else. I think that's very unique. That's probably why they've become super popular. But they were originally, so it's 1959. There was 1957. There was a Russian, I don't know if he was a doctor or scientist, but he kind of coined the phrase. And I think that they were using, my understanding is that they were using them in sort of for helping astronauts going to space. That's what the first research was used to help with reducing the effects of stress of going into space travel, which is when they started researching. So he coined the term, and there's like 4 different characteristics that a herb has to have to be considered to be adaptogen. So they have to be normalizing in the body, non-toxic, nourishing, and non-specific. So they have kind of a broad range of actions. So generally they work by helping to promote homeostasis in the body and modulating the HPA axis. That's how most of them work. So their effects are to do with helping to improve resilience when you're under stress. I mean, there's some trials that have been done in animal studies and like in vitro studies which show that they have anti-depressive effects, that they can support the immune system, they can help with fatigue, that they can help with brain cognition, and then there's human trials that show that they can help with fatigue against a background of sort of mental stress and help with resilience. So and obviously there's a huge there's lots of different types of adaptogens, and there's different there are, and you can kind of pick, when I'm using them, I'm kind of thinking, what do I want the emphasis to be on? So some adaptogens are a bit more supportive for the immune system, or they can be like modulating to the immune system, which is really helpful, because you don't really want to overstimulate the immune system, obviously. So it's much more helpful to modulate it and balance it. So like the medicinal mushrooms are often good for that. Astragalus, that's a lovely adaptogen for the immune system that's modulating. And then you've got the more stimulating adaptogens such as the ginseng. So like Panax ginseng is the most stimulating. You've got Siberian ginseng. And these are these are good when someone's exhausted. So often you would use those when people like burnout sort of situation, and rhodiola as well. So they're very nice for modulating the cortisol response. If someone's in that kind of phase 2, phase 3 stress response where cortisol might be kind of high, there might be spikes in cortisol, or it's, or it's dropping, someone's becoming kind of unresponsive and it's starting to sort of flatline. It can be useful in both of those situations. It can kind of help to modulate cortisol. And then you have ashwagandha, probably the most popular one, which is Also, it's lovely because it's relaxing. I think the key thing with ashwagandha that makes it so helpful is it's good for that sort of tired but wired phase where you're, you've overstimulated because you've been doing too much, probably your cortisol's a bit too high, your sympathetic nervous system's in overdrive, but you're actually exhausted. You can't sleep because you're kind of wired. So it's helpful because it can help to reduce the cortisol and relax and help you to sleep, but it's very nourishing to the body, when you're depleted, and it can help to, again, it helps to modulate the immune system. It's sometimes used in cancer support as well. It can help with the helping reduce the effects of chemo, and if you, obviously to be used with a lot of care and professional guidance for that, but they do have different, there's kind of different areas that they can be used in.
So this is what I love and I have an issue with when it comes to these kind of ingredients being put in all these different products, right? Because it seems that there is some evidence that it is relevant for certain condition states, and a lot of people, particularly in your practice, for whom you've prescribed these to, have benefited from them. But if I go to my local sort of herbal pharmacy or Whole Foods, or that you'll find them in supermarkets these days as well, and regular pharmacies, there isn't that sort of personalization. It's just adaptogenic, and that can be applied to rhodiola, astragalus, ashwagandha, and I don't know whether that's going to be good for me or that's not relevant for me. And people will just pick one up because probably one of their mates down the pub has said, "Oh, you need to get yourself some adaptogens. It's really calming."
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
yeah.
And I've got some really good GP friends who have benefited from ashwagandha. They absolutely swear by it. They take it every single day. They obviously live very stressful lives, and they've told me to take it. I've tried it myself, and I haven't had any effect. But I don't know anything about the dose. I don't know anything about the quality of the product. And if I don't know, and I obsess about all these kind of things, I'm pretty sure most people, even those listening to this, don't know either. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a huge problem. I think there needs to be a lot more education. I hope it will. I mean, I really hope that will come as people get more interested. It's a minefield. And I mean, obviously, I see people come with huge carrier bags of things they've been and bought, and they don't know what they're doing with them. And, they're like, "Oh, should I be taking all these? Yeah, I've got 20 in a bag or something." I'm like, "No, no, you shouldn't." But, that's exactly what happens. And I don't know, I feel like maybe a little bit of knowledge is not a good thing sometimes, because and people do try to kind of, they kind of try and make these combinations, and it's difficult. We're in a difficult position, aren't we? Because most GPs don't really have the knowledge, and you can search online, you can get huge amounts of information which is not personalized, and
so for someone listening to this who could probably who may benefit from taking these kind of products, adaptogens, or the others that we'll discuss, before we even get to discussing them, maybe we should sort of think of a blueprint or a strategy for approaching these additions to one's lifestyle before they get sort of sucked into the advertising, supplements. Oh, this is good for your brain, or this is good for your gut, or this is, do you know what I mean? Maybe would you always want someone to see a practitioner like yourself, or have that sort of human touch before they go and invest in different supplements? Is that the way you think?
I think that is I mean, that's the ideal, isn't it? Because I think, even, I have to be quite honest, even me doing this job for nearly 20 years, I can't treat myself. It's very hard to be objective, even when I know sometimes what's wrong with me, but still to be objective with myself is very difficult. So even the knowledge is not, it's not all of it. It's actually the objective look at you, and somebody, that's what's so helpful about seeing somebody as well. I mean, I think a medical herbalist, and a nutritionist is often very knowledgeable as well, so then maybe they don't have the detailed knowledge of the herbs, but very often a lot of nutritionists use adaptogens and are trained in using adaptogens. So I think that that's going to help you to get a more personalized, more tailored approach, and also they will be able to recommend very good quality, because the quality is another issue, which is another thing which I have to say I'm very passionate about and talk a lot about with patients, is the quality of things you're buying, because it's an unregulated market, at the moment, so if you're buying something, the quality is a huge issue, because you won't get any benefit if it's poor quality, and if it's adulterated or contaminated, then obviously there's problems with that, because it's there might be safety issues. But that's another thing to kind of, I think that education needs to happen around, is the quality of the products, and and also for me, like the ethical harvesting, because I know with the herbs we're using in our teas, for example, we're looking at fair wild certification, and for me that's another thing. If these things become very popular, I don't want to see the whole of the ecosystem being destroyed, and that we end up and we don't have any of these herbs left, and that's happened with some herbs in the past. They've become endangered, or
really?
like golden seal, which is an amazing herb. It's like a natural antibiotic, which is really very effective for infections. I've used it a lot in sort of ear infections, chest infections, sore throats, and it's very effective, but it's almost endangered it's nearly gone in the wild from over harvesting. And
Wow.
so I don't want that to happen. You don't want to think, oh gosh, we're getting we're so all loving these herbs so much that that they're actually going to disappear from the wild, and that it's not being harvested sustainably. So I think that's the other thing, that I hope that there'll be more awareness of that. But you've got to think about the quality, because it's obviously with the herbs, there's a lot dependent on how they were grown, how they were harvested, how they were processed, and along that whole process of the production of it, there needs to be traceability checks. There needs to be, all the herbs we use in our clinic, there's batch testing on each one. So you're looking at the levels of the active ingredients, you're looking for heavy metals, for pesticides, that's all got to be kind of checked for. And and how it's been stored, if it's very old and it's been stored in a warehouse that's in very hot country, for example, there's not going to be many active ingredients left in that, whereas something that's been harvested and processed correctly, and used, depending on obviously the herb, but something with volatile oils in, they're going to degrade quite quickly. So that there's lots of things at the moment. I think I totally agree with you. I don't think people understand the complexity and maybe quite what they're buying.
So similarly, for as a strategy to what we just talked about with adaptogens, you want to make sure that you're personalizing your adaptogen choice, let's say, on top of everything else that you're going to be correcting or trying to optimize within your lifestyle, whatever is causing stress or inflammation in your body. In terms of choosing the right product, what are some key things or key metrics to look out for an individual who's finding themselves in a health food store, with the abundance of labels and claims on the shelf, and they're sort of overwhelmed as to what type of boswellia or turmeric or devil's claw to sort of choose?
I think that the key thing is to look for the good manufacturing practice. So that's the first thing I would recommend people look for. So any reputable company is going to be signed up to the good manufacturing practice. It's a voluntary quality assurance scheme, but it basically means there's traceability. There's good manufacturing practice covers everything from the harvesting to the production of the supplements or the herbs. So so that's kind of the basis that so anything that we use in our clinic, that's the basic quality assurance that we'd look for. So there has to be, so good manufacturing practice is just like a little GMP. It will be a little stamp on the product, and you'll often see it if you go on a website. You'll see that. I mean, what I always look for is someone asks me, "Oh, what's about this supplement, Sally? You know, like, is this any good?" And I don't know the company. It's quite easy to look at on the website, and they should have traceability information on there, like how do they test it, are each batch tested, have they signed up for good manufacturing practice, do they know where their herbs are coming from? You know, that all should be on the website. It's quite easy to see a reputable company because they're testing, they've got traceability, you know, that they're taking that really seriously. They will kind of advertise that, you know, that will be on there. And, you know, if you're looking for ethically sourced, then there's the Fair Wild certification, which means that, you know, that they're being harvested sustainably. So you can look for those. And then within our clinic as well, we kind of audit our supplements, and there's also some further quality assurances. There's an American quality assurance sort of stamp that has further, like, there's a bronze, silver, gold for that, with the gold ones being that every batch is tested, every single supplement that comes out of that factory is tested for quality. So, you know, that's kind of the top, and they're obviously the more expensive ones. But, you know, if I'm looking, particularly if I've got someone who's very ill, you know, with serious chronic health conditions, or is very allergic, you know, to things, and very sensitive, then, you know, we're using those kind of very high grade ones where, you know, that there's nothing mixed in, that there's very good levels of everything, and that everything's tested really very accurately.
So that's did you say Emerson Gold?
Emerson, yeah.
Oh, okay, Emerson. Okay, I'll look out for that.
Yeah.
I don't think I've come across that before. It
No,
must
it's
be
an
like,
American
are those only ones that you have to be a practitioner?
Yeah,
or...
they're often the practitioner supplements. Yeah. That's the thing of seeing a practitioner.
And, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, actually, with some of those very high quality ones, some of them are practitioner only, for that reason. Yeah, because they're very high. You know, they're kind of the higher dosing quality ones.
Gotcha. Yeah. Let's dive into some of these herbs that I have no experience sort of prescribing, or I haven't done any research around them really, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn a bit more. So, Boswellia serrata. Why don't we start with that? I've been the reason why I'm asking this is because I've been asked about it, and I've got no experience sort of prescribing or anything. So, what is it used for, and what are the properties?
Yeah, so it's an anti-inflammatory. I mean, it's often used alongside turmeric. So I used it for a long time alongside turmeric in arthritis. So it's a similar action to turmeric. So they both have this action on NF-kappa B, so reducing the inflammatory cascade in the body, and on the COX-2 inhibitors. So they've both got, you know, anti-inflammatory properties. And it's an oleoresin, so it comes from the resin from the plant, and obviously it's used in a lot of traditional medical systems. There also is some interesting research on it. I have seen some research on it used in brain tumors, actually, very small studies, but being used for having positive effects for helping with brain tumors as well. So it's sometimes used in cancer care as well for supporting, well, particularly, like I say, in brain tumors or brain mets as well. I've seen it used.
What plant does it come from? Sorry, but I'm just trying to visualize it, and I know what turmeric looks like, but
frankincense.
Oh, frankincense. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So is it like an oil, or is it like how is it delivered?
It's a resin. So yeah, it's a resin from the plant. So when you see it, it's like these little lumps of resin, like it is very thick and sticky. So it's actually quite hard to extract. So when you extract it into a tincture, it's It tastes absolutely disgusting. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't use it in a tincture. I have tried, and it's really foul. I mean, so it's more generally used in powder form, and so that's how I've used it, as a powder mixed in with turmeric in capsule form, actually.
And so it works on NF-kappa B and COX-2, similar to how some of our sort of like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories work as well. Any other sort of effects? I know like turmeric is pretty multifactorial. Like it can, I think it has like a similar activity to some of statins that I prescribe.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
It can have an effect on free fatty acids. But anything else with Boswellia in particular?
So it can reduce the inflammatory prostaglandins. I mean, it works it's similar in many ways to the turmeric. I don't think there's quite as much research into Boswellia. I mean, turmeric has got huge amounts of research, hasn't it? Whereas Boswellia is not so well researched. So as far, I mean, it doesn't have the kind of hepatic effects that turmeric does, or the I don't know of it as being really used for high cholesterol like turmeric, or having those kind of, it's not got that kind of wider use that turmeric has. It's more targeted. I really see it as more being an anti-inflammatory, more targeted. And then, like I say, for more sort of use in cancer, that's kind of where I've seen it used the most, really. Yeah, it's certainly not as wide as turmeric in its uses.
And in terms of like inflammation fighting herbs and tinctures and stuff, obviously, like, you know, inflammation isn't the enemy, and inflammation is a very important process. It's part of the immune system. It's how we fight off infections and stuff. So there's a balance to be struck. But let's assume that we're dealing with patients who have excess inflammation for whatever upstream cause. What else is in sort of like your basket of goods when it comes to inflammation balancing effects?
Yeah, there's loads. I mean, there's actually loads. I think herbs are really quite, they're very useful for inflammation. So you've got sort of like your more systemic ones. I mean, and you've got the really well-known ones. I mean, ginger's another one that's had quite a lot of research on. And then you've got sort of ones which are more specific for different systems. So like devil's claw, one that I used a lot again for arthritis. So and then, I mean, you've got there's just, I mean, you could go on forever, really. There's
what is devil's claw? I've heard of this thing again. I think I must have seen it in a store, and I no idea what it sounds aggressive.
It does actually, doesn't it? I never thought of that. Yeah, it's not a very nice name, actually, is it? No. It's a South African herb. It's a really interesting. It's got a lot of research for arthritis, for helping with pain and stiffness. A lot of herbs work in a similar way, on the kind of NF-kappa B or COX-2, or they work by helping to reduce those inflammatory cytokines. There's very similar pathways in terms of how most of them are working, but sometimes they have more specific kind of actions in particular systems in the body. And devil's claw has that, so it's very targeted towards musculoskeletal system. There's some good trials on it for back pain, and it's often used in arthritis. So it's quite it's used a lot in South Africa, I mean, which is where it comes from originally. But so it's part of their sort of traditional medical system there. But yeah, I mean, I used it. When I was doing a lot more with arthritis patients, I'd often use it alongside, so the turmeric, the boswellia, and the devil's claw together with some ginger. That was kind of a standard capsule that I would use, and then some black pepper.
Oh, so is it like pre-mixed sort of thing?
Well, they're formulas that I had in my dispensary. So I had them. We kind of I made a formula, and then we have them made up for the clinic. So but that's how I was using it. But you could also, it's often used in tincture form as well. Devil's claw is I mean, some of these herbs, and I think just thinking of how you're using them, because that's quite helpful maybe to think about too, is, because often there's different ways of using the herbs. You can think of the tisanes and the teas and the tinctures, and then using capsules, and that's dependent on the constituents you're trying to extract maybe, or sometimes the taste as well, because I know, like devil's claw doesn't taste very nice as well. So there's certain herbs that you would not want to put in a tea, for example, because they're really horrible.
Right, yeah.
And then certain herbs that would be like marshmallow, which is probably one of my favorite herbs, is extracted best in water. So that's, you're best to use that actually overnight infusion, where you soak the roots overnight in water, and then that's the best extraction for the marshmallow root. So it's there are variants in how you can extract the different constituents, and that will have an impact on how effective they are used in the body as well. So so I mean, and the taste, like I say, because some of these ones we're talking about, like the boswellia and the devil's claw, are just disgusting. So I think if someone was going to make a tea, I definitely would not do that with those.
How do you determine like the dose for the individual? Because this is one of my sort of bugbears with the sort of nootropic and adaptogenic trend of just like putting it in, like, your chocolate and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's sort of similar to, do you remember Benecol? I don't know if Benecol is still around.
Yes.
But it was a phytosterol based margarine.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, if you put this on your bread every single day, it will reduce your cholesterol. And I was just thinking, well, it's sort of like an inefficient way to get the correct dose of the active ingredients of that particular food. If you're trying to lower your cholesterol, you'd rather just like have a really good diet, and then if you need to take lipid lowering therapy, you just take that on top. That's the way I think about things. And so if I'm having a chocolate bar with a bit of ashwagandha in, I'd rather just have normal chocolate and then take a specific dose of the ingredient, the herb, in my daily routine. And so how do you think about sort of dosing? And again, is that personalized to the individual, or are they sort of set standard doses for this sort of this sort of practice?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's gimmicky, I'm afraid. I just think, like, are you really getting any benefit from that? I don't know. Like, so sometimes they are, aren't they? I think they're just kind of like put on the label to make, but it's kind of marketing, isn't it? You look at the ingredient, maybe there's not actually very much in there. So I mean, with dosing, and there's different traditions with dosing. So looking at different sort of if you're looking, say, in traditional Chinese medicine with herbs, they tend to go quite high dosing. So you'll see often very high doses that they'll use of herbs there. And then you'll see in different traditions, different dosage. So there is a spectrum, like, and you'll see herbalists trained in different traditions will use different doses. So, and for example, when I was training, sometimes, some of the lecturers we had would be using like drop doses. They're using very tiny, almost homeopathic or very small dosing. And then, like I say, you'd kind of go up to some of the Chinese, when you're reading, the kind of formulas for the Chinese medicine, they're very high dosing. And I don't know whether it's interesting to think, like, have these differences developed because of the genetics of the kind of cohorts of people they were treating. I mean, I don't know whether in different cultures people have different genetics, and that might influence the dosing strategies. I don't know. It's quite interesting because there's quite a bit of disparity between different traditions on how much you do use. But and in the West here in the UK, we're quite a hybrid. Like, we've got influences from many different traditions. So you'll see that we have got influences from these kind of traditional European systems. We've got some influences from Ayurveda. There's often TCM influences, and then you've kind of looking. There's often influences from America, like there's the physiomedicalist herbalism, which was in America. You've got there was quite a big move of knowledge over from Native American Indians with, when the wagon trains went over, and then a lot of that knowledge came back to the UK as well. So we've got some of our herbs are traditional Native American herbs, like echinacea is a Native American Indian herb that was used there and that came into this country. So we're a little bit of a melting pot with influences, and you kind of often see that in the dosing as well, and in the way that the formulas are produced. So, you might see people using a simple, which is like one herb on its own. You might see more complex formulas. And then, going into kind of a traditional Chinese medicine system, they use a lot of herbs together in quite complex formulas. So you're maybe getting smaller amounts of individual herbs, but you'll have a synergistic effect with them. So, I mean, that's quite an interesting way to practice, is because very much in the Chinese system, you will use, like, they'll have a way of writing a prescription where you have like a leading herb, which is your more active one, and then you have secondary herbs, and then you'll have like a harmonizing herb, which it kind of enhances the effect of all of it. So you might be using 3 secondary herbs with similar actions, but they work synergistically. So there's actually quite a lot of science behind how you combine them, the way that you use the dosing, whether you use small amounts of synergistic herbs or whether you kind of go mega dosing with one herb. So, and I've kind of, my original training was in the Western herbal approach, which is quite simple. So you kind of, we were trained like, you should just have 5 herbs in a prescription, and they need to be quite high dosing, and it's more simple. And then I did quite a lot of training in TCM, and I kind of ended up like with some sort of hybrid way of prescribing, which I use. I love the TCM system and the way that, that they kind of use the diagnosis that you do in TCM. And so I actually do use a kind of more TCM approach often with my herbal prescribing. So I'll often use this way of doing synergistic herbs at smaller doses. So you can, there's different ways of doing it. So I think if you're looking at, just using one herb on its own, it's good to look at the research about, for example, turmeric, there's good research with different dosing strategies. So, there's some of the studies in osteoarthritis on turmeric, the average that's used there is about 850 milligrams a day, and that's for like curcumin extract. So, you've kind of got, there's, research for that. If you're using it in ulcerative colitis, then you generally need a higher dose. So there's studies show like 2,500 milligrams a day to be effective. So you can kind of look at studies and see, in certain conditions, if you're looking at it as a simple, it kind of depends on what you're using it for. And then when you're using them in combinations and formulas, you're driven more by the traditions of, like I say, how it kind of fits together in a formula. But yeah, and even
that's
with
a really interesting sort of
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a really interesting insight into the differences in practices. I mean, like we're pretty sort of algorithm focused. So if I'm going to be starting someone on lipid lowering therapy, let's say for the listeners, high cholesterol, or someone with gastritis, we're going to start at a minimal dose of the first recommended medication, and then titrate upwards as needed, or change if there is any side effects, and then go to second generation, third generation, etc., etc. Whereas it seems with medical herbalism and perhaps other sort of practices, there's a bit of a hybrid approach and sort of like test and feel as you go along. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's known sort of safety parameters of, like, okay, these are and there is the kind of, when you're training, you're looking at, okay, these are there's parameters. It's not just like there's no kind of guidelines, you do. But I think that, certainly from my experience, what I know is that people respond in different ways. So I'm very much looking at So when you're kind of treating holistically, you might be looking at, okay, this person is quite sensitive. So, you know, that they've had a lot of reactions, for example, in the past to medications or food. I'm going to go with a smaller dose. So, you know, for somebody with that sort of history, I'll be thinking, well, actually, I'm probably going to go with maybe half of a sort of standard dose. Whereas somebody maybe who has got really severe symptoms but is quite robust, you know, they've never had any problems with sensitivities in the past, I'm just going to go with obviously a higher dose. So, you know, you have parameters for each herb where there's recommendations of like grams per day or mils per day for the tinctures. And then you're kind of working within that, which I'm sure is kind of what everybody's doing in practice, isn't it? You know, you kind of, if you've got somebody in front of you who you know is like super reactive and has got a long list of had side effects to lots of things, you'll go in with a smaller dose. But there are, you know, there for each herb there are sort of standard doses for kind of how they've been used traditionally, and that's, you know, you're just taught
I'd love to sort of I'd love to sort of workshop some random examples of how medical herbalism could work alongside conventional. So let's say we have like a typical patient that doesn't have any other medical comorbidities and they've got gastritis. Let's just assume that they've had an endoscopy and everything's normal. They don't have like a Barrett's esophagus. They don't have an ulcer. They don't have anything to suggest anything more severe, but they are requiring let's say 10 to 20 milligrams of omeprazole, a PPI, as and when, or they use it regularly, let's say, otherwise they get symptoms. And let's say we've optimized all their lifestyle stuff. You know, we've stopped them having too many fried foods. We've stopped them having like high sugar. We've tried to maintain an eating window. We're getting them not to eat too late, etc., etc. You know, as a conventional medic, my only tools are sort of those medications, and I just mess around with the doses. I go up and down. I might change one. I might add something else, but I'm kind of limited to that. And I wonder how you might approach that patient who, you know, they've seen me as the GP. The GP is not doing anything. I need some relief. Like how would you approach that?
Yeah, so that's quite common. I do see lots of people with that.
Yeah, I thought so. That's what I thought it would work.
Yeah, I do. That is a really good example. So I'd probably start with something simple like slippery elm. So that's probably my go-to easy start somebody on. So slippery elm's really nice. It's high in polysaccharides. It just coats the gut. It's very healing. So I would often go slippery elm and marshmallow root. So both of those are high in these polysaccharides. They're very healing, and they kind of reduce irritation and inflammation. And they have some prebiotic effects as well, like the slippery elm. So they're really nice for just settling the gut. So they're kind of simple things. The slippery elm, you can use it as a powder. So I'd often get people to either make it into a drink, or you can mix it up with a type of milk, you know, non-dairy milk, or and then the marshmallow root you soak. So it's the root, you soak it overnight, and then you just drink it. And you can kind of drink it PRN, you know, as much as you like through the day, really. So it's and it's just, again, it's very soothing. So they're probably like the easy things I would just go to. And then I'd often add in.
And sorry, part of my ignorance. What is slippery elm?
I've
definitely heard of it, but I don't know where it comes from or what it is.
Yeah. It's a bark of a tree, slippery, Ulmus fulva, and it's when you it's a powder. Well, it's a bark that's then powdered, and when you add water to it, it goes very gloopy. It's got lots of polysaccharides and mucilagin, which means it's a little bit like if you mix water with it, it goes into like a wallpaper paste. It's like really gloopy. And very soothing. So it's a really old traditional. It's used for stomach ache. You know, it's a long history of use, and it was also often used for children who couldn't take breast milk. I think it was made into like a gruel. It's very sort of nourishing, so it was used as a food for babies as well. So it's got lots of nutrients in, but the main thing is it's like very coating and soothing. So it's good for any kind of irritation. Like, so I'd use it upper digestion, so heartburn, indigestion, reflux, but also kind of lower down. You can use it for sort of IBS or even in IBD. It's very it's soothing to the whole gut, really. So yeah, that it is very simple to use. It the only thing you have to be a little bit careful with slippery arm, because you're kind of coating everything. You have to use it in between meals or between medication, because it can stop the absorption of other things, because it's just kind of coating, and it's a bit of a barrier effect, really. So
awesome.
Yeah, so it's a very simple, nice one to use first. And then I might add in like a DGL licorice, which I don't know if you've heard of that, or you
No.
So
What's DGL?
so the licorice is another herb with it's anti-inflammatory, so works on that kind of NF kappa B inhibition, and it's very soothing and healing, good for the digestion. But you have to be a little bit careful with licorice because of the glycyrrhizin in it. So if you take glycyrrhizin or licorice in excess doses, it can cause increase in blood pressure. So that is one herb you have to be a bit careful with in terms of overusing, particularly somebody with high blood pressure. So the DGL licorice is a deglycyrized licorice. So it's like you take out that glycyrrhizin, and that's really nice. You can get it in capsules, you can get it in chewable tablets, and it's really good for people with gastritis or heartburn, because they often chew it before they go to bed, and it's really great for, you can have it in your bag, and you just, if you get any heartburn, you just chew on it, and it's really effective for reducing acid and heartburn and reflux symptoms, and it's healing. It's
awesome.
really helpful for helping it to heal up as well. So
yeah That's great. I want to workshop another one.
Okay,
sorry,
go for it.
This is great. This is really, I think this is really useful for other people to think about, how they can potentially utilize these strategies in their lifestyle as well. So another common one is high cholesterol. So let's say we have a man or a woman, let's say in their 50s. They've got persistently raised cholesterol. They've already been seen by the lipid clinic. There isn't a sort of familial hypercholesterolemia, but there are at risk of cardiovascular disease. No matter what dose, or let's say they are on high doses, or they've been on high doses of statins and fibrates before. They don't tolerate the really high doses. They can just about tolerate a low dose of statin, but their cholesterol is still outside of the range that we want it to be. Let's say it's above 6.5, or let's say 7. We're optimizing everything else in their diet. So they're on a low sugar diet. They do not have a high amount of saturates coming from meat products in their diet. They've basically optimized their exercise. So we're trying to push up their HDLs. What would you recommend to this mythical patient here? Because this is another common one that I reckon a lot of GPs would struggle with as well.
Yeah, it's true. And I probably don't see that so often that I used to. But I mean, in the past, I have had success in terms of, usually what I've done is a combination of, so in herbal medicine, you're looking at often supporting the liver. So you'll often use things like the bitter herbs, which can help with, so the bitter herbs stimulate digestion and increase bile production, and so help with kind of nutrient absorption and breakdown, really kind of helping to break down and emulsify fats, for example. So you'd often use the bitter herbs. So you might things like dandelion root, or you could use artichoke. There's some small studies about artichoke with it. I mean, the research for I've tried different approaches actually for cholesterol. So I actually the last patient I had, I've actually gone like a TCM kind of approach, which is where you do quite a specialized, you're kind of looking at the patterns in the body. And if you look at TCM, you'll see this pattern of like phlegm, which is, kind of makes sense if you think of cholesterol, I guess, in terms of damp. They could talk about dampness again. So, I've kind of gone with a bit of a TCM approach, which has been successful. That's kind of a lot of different Chinese herbs that I've used. But in terms of simple things, then, you've got like turmeric. There's some studies on turmeric working in a similar way to statins, so, that would be a simple thing to put in. And that, that would be and that's going to probably help with insulin sensitivity as well, which might be linked. So, that could be helpful. Or I'd go bitters. So I'd just go with like the dandelion root, and those kind of simple bitters. That's kind of what I've done in the past until I started having a go with the more kind of complicated TCM approach. But that's very personalized because you're kind of looking at the patterns of a lot of different things. So I think if you want simple, I'd just go with the turmeric. There's some evidence for Commiphora molmon called Google, which which is ayurvedic herb. That there's some evidence for that for use in cholesterol, which I've experimented a little bit with that, and I have put that in formulas as well. In again, like with the bitters and the turmeric and the and I've had some success with that, but it wasn't kind of consistent, I would say.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? With sort of the more personalized approach, it's harder to sort of just give general advice, but I'll just do this, and we'll whack your cholesterol down. And I think there's the expectation. I think partly because of the way we've presented Western medicine from the patient, that's how it should be. And I think what we're seeing offered in sort of online stores and sort of wellness pharmacies is the similar model that patients have been sort of taught to expect. And I think that's wrong. And I think the more personalized traditional Chinese medicine, TCM measures and ayurvedic measures, I think are probably going to be a lot more popular, or should be at least anyway, because it's not a one size fits all, like you've eloquently just explained.
Yeah, I mean, it is more effective, like if you personalize. I mean, what we're doing in the clinic now, which I find really interesting now, we're also doing like the nutrigenomics testing and things as well. So some of our nutritionists are really are kind of trained with life code, and I've been doing a bit of that, and that's just fascinating. You start looking at the SNPs and all these variations that we all have, and you think like, well, no wonder we all react differently. We're actually genetically there's these differences, and and also when you start looking at gut microbiome and all these pathways, we're all just, there's no wonder that we react in different ways to things.
It's going to look pretty archaic, I think, in the next 10-15 years. We look back at how we would prescribe sort of one size fits all medications within medicine, just me giving a statin to whoever comes in the door without really knowing what their single nucleotide polymorphisms are, their sort of genetic variability. Like, it's going to be like, what? I can't believe we were doing that just 10 years ago.
I know.
On the subject of limitations, I think with herbal medicine, I think I don't want to give the impression that you can just take these herbs and you'll be fine. What kind of key things do you always want to make sure whenever you're prescribing medical herbs that patients are on in terms of other medications, and also other sort of considerations with other condition states?
Yeah. So that's really important to think about that. So obviously there's some herbs that have more contraindications than others. So St. John's wort's the big one, So obviously if you're thinking that you want to prescribe that, you're going to have to look at if they are in any medication. So there's quite a lot of interactions. So you're going to have to think about, some herbs we know act on the CYP450 liver enzyme system. So that's the kind of big one, because that's going to potentially interact with how some pharmaceutical drugs are broken down. So, the St. John's Wood's a big one. You have to be careful with that, with like the oral contraceptive pill. That's a big one that I don't know if people are always aware of, because it can make the pill not so effective. So I think one way to make you more depressed is potentially to find out you're pregnant when you didn't mean to be. I always think, oh God, I definitely don't want to do that. If someone, is struggling already with low mood, now they have an unwanted pregnancy as well. So that's a big one. And the immunosuppressant drugs and warfarin, digoxin. So obviously, like St. John's Wort, you have to be careful with those, and immunosuppressant drugs. And then there are some herbs which can have blood thinning effects. So, for example, ginkgo, high doses of garlic, turmeric, Chinese angelica. You might need to. I would always tell people to stop them at like a week before surgery, or obviously also contraindicated with anybody on kind of blood thinners. So there's some herbs that have that. Not so, like turmeric, I wouldn't in just food state, but if they're on a high dose, you might need to be careful with blood thinners, like I say, or surgery, or dental, if they're having extensive dental treatment, for example. So licorice, you have to be careful with high blood pressure, particularly if they're having high doses of that. And then there's there are, they're the big ones that you kind of need to be careful with. I mean, in terms of herb drug interactions, there are some, if you start looking at the literature, you can see theoretical concerns which come from maybe in vitro studies, very high doses in vitro studies. And then you can, and then there's a whole kind of spectrum of, okay, we go from theoretical concern with in vitro isolated constituents to actually case studies of documented, with St. John's Wort, for example, there's the kind of documented cases of reported problems. So you've got a spectrum, and normally, if you're looking at prescribing them, you're kind of obviously avoiding all the contraindicated ones. For anything in the middle, you might be just monitoring closely, or you might just be giving a lower dose. You kind of got, there's a bit of an in between sometimes with just monitoring more closely, or making that call of kind of risk benefit analysis really that you're doing in the middle there. So generally I'd say herbs are very well tolerated. So you kind of, as long as you know these main areas to be careful with. The other big things in terms of, obviously, is people on chemotherapy, which is obviously very, you have to be very careful with that, or an immunosuppressant medication, anywhere where that warfarin, digoxin, where there's a narrow therapeutic index, all of those type of medications have to be very, obviously that is a whole area you have to be very careful with. And then in terms of patients, you're obviously anybody with sort of liver kidney issues where it might reduce the excretion, or blood coagulation problems, it's kind of severe allergies. You've obviously got to be looking for all those more serious problems that are going to affect maybe how your body's metabolizing the herbs, for example, or excreting them, or obviously they're pregnant or elderly, maybe reduced kidney function, for example, with elderly patients. So kind of all those kind of normal kind of contraindications that you would be looking for. And I think probably the main things in practice are just being aware of the main herb drug interactions. And I think I've been using herbs for like nearly 18 years now, and like touchwood, I've never really seen, I haven't in practice ever seen any serious adverse effects. And and I see patients who are on medication all the time. So I think as long as you're using them safely, like I say, touchwood, I haven't seen any problems. So I think it's quite possible to use them safely. You just obviously have to be careful with how you're doing it, and looking for the the red flags, and just being aware of when you should be using, how to use them safely, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for anyone listening to this and we're interested in like sort of a layperson's guide to medical herbs, are there resources or books that you point people towards? So, if they do have persistent UTIs, or they have menopausal symptoms, or they have other digestive complaints, they can sort of get some sort of guide as to, okay, what herbs might be appropriate for them before they entertain maybe, booking an appointment and having more regular sort of follow-ups.
I mean, there's some lovely books. The first book that I ever was given and was my Bible for a long time was the Andrew Chevalier book, the Encyclopedia of Herbal Medicine.
Okay.
And Andrew Chevalier was a president of the National Institute of Medical Herbalists for a long time, and is really, he's a very well known herbalist, and his books are really, it is an encyclopedia. That was the one that I kind of started with. So I think that's probably a really good one to use. The other person that I use a lot when I was initially starting for women, particularly for women's health, for children and pregnancy, is Aviva Rom. So she's produced quite a lot of different books. She's absolutely fantastic. She's American. She's actually a herbalist, a midwife, and a doctor as well. And she is her books are fun. She's prolifically writing books, but they're really grounded, very, very easy to use, with actually doses in and how to use everything. And I mean, she's an amazing resource. So for like I say, for any women's health problems, she's written books for how to use herbs in children, and in pregnancy as well. So her books are very, very helpful. And then there was another, trying to remember the name, I think it's David Hoffman, which is the other book that we kind of started with when I was starting, which is another sort of nice general introduction and basic recipes and like how to treat simple things. That was another good one that I used when I was first starting. I think if you get one that's written by a medical herbalist, you're getting that experience, aren't you? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely going to look into those for sure. And I want to bring this to a close because I feel like I'm just peppering you with questions about. I should really just do a BSc in medical herbalism myself rather than badger you about.
No, I love it. I could talk all day about it.
But yeah, like, are there sort of basic sort of collections of medical herbs in small doses that you would say, okay, this is like a nice sort of foundational level to just maintain? I mean, I'm a relatively healthy person, eat very well, obviously, don't have too much stress in my life. Is there sort of like the equivalent of a multivitamin, even though I don't actually recommend multivitamins, but you know the point. The point I'm trying to make is like
I do know what you
foundational support in terms of like collections of medical herbs that you think most people would benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to kind of give generic advice, I guess, for that, because I think it is different for everybody. I guess some of the more nutritive ones, so like nettles, maybe. That would be something that could be helpful. The other, what's might be interesting for you to look at as well, is in Ayurvedic medicine, you have these kind of tonics which are used for longevity, and I quite like the idea of these. So there's things like Gotu Kola, which I guess if I was kind of thinking about anything, I'd probably just go with something like that. Maybe just Gotu Kola, because it's going to be good for kind of brain function, and it has that tradition used for kind of longevity. So I think that's kind of what I'd be going for, the Ayurvedic, these longevity tonics, because I just feel like that's kind of what we all want, really, isn't it? So, they're the ones to go for.
And in terms of like teas, is that like a nice sort of gentle way into have some medical herbs in your life? Is that because they're not particularly high dose, I'm assuming, and it'd be very hard to have significant side effects from them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what I've tried to do with the teas that I've done, is do nice formulas for everyday, for people to use every day, every day. So, absolutely. I think teas are a great way in. So, that's, again, like, I've used Tulsi in quite a few of the teas that I've created. And for that very reason, because I think that's another one of those kind of nice, gentle, adaptogenic longevity herbs, and it's nice for sort of reducing anxiety and for brain function. So it's that's another nice one to take as a tea. I'd say mostly with herbs, and I think with food it's the same advice in terms of diversity. I'm quite into having little bits of different things. If you think about the gut microbiome and how, now the advice that I'm always giving people is diversity and having a rainbow diet and having all those different phytonutrients, and it's the range of all of them which is important. And I think it's the same with the herbs as well, to an extent. If you're kind of having little bits of lots of these herbs, as long as you're not trying to treat something, if you're looking for just a general overall health support, having diversity is helpful. So maybe using the spices and ginger. I mean, I love doing ginger, just as like a decoction. So taking a fresh ginger root, chopping that up, and then like simmering it for 15 minutes and having that as a drink. So that's a nice thing that you can do. And so there's these simple things but having a bit of diversity. I think if you're going to do something every single day, unless you've got a health problem you're trying to address it, that's probably it's not as beneficial as having diversity with what you're having, because lots of these herbs have different effects in the body. And some of them, I mean, I was looking at some research where, for example, licorice can help change the gut microbiome, so it helps to improve lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, and I think it's the same. Lots of these flavonoids in the herbs. Herbs have, most herbs have some types of flavonoids in. They've got all these lovely antioxidant effects. Actually, it's the same advice in terms of like a rainbow diet. You have lots of these different types of flavonoids. You're going to get all these different diverse antioxidant benefits, and and the herbs that help with the gut microbiome are going to be helpful for, again, that kind of diversity of creating a kind of robust biome as well. So it's the same kind of advice, I think, really.
Yeah. Well, Sally, this has been super educational for me. I've loved the workshopping as well. And I'll dive into more of your teas as well. I think they're really good because, like I said at the start, I infuse them and I'll put them into bottles and I just keep them in my fridge, because when you want something a little bit more flavorful than just plain water, and I love water, but like a little bit, you want something a bit more exciting than plain water. They're lovely to have, and I honestly think there's like a niche in flavored water with herbs and certain spices, and even like got cola and that kind of stuff that hasn't really been tapped into. So I'd love to see that.
Maybe I should be doing that next.
Out there.
Maybe you should be doing that. That's my new strategy. Thank you, Ruby.
Awesome.